So, good afternoon, everyone. So, welcome back to this session. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Chaitanya Gokhale from the University of Würzburg. Chaitanya did his PhD from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Biology in Cologne. And then after a postdoc at Massey University in New Zealand, he came back and started his own independent group at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Biology. And after spending some time there, he recently moved, maybe not so recently, maybe a couple of years ago, moved to the University of Würzburg as a professor of theoretical biology. And actually, I've known Chaitanya indirectly for a long time. And when I was starting to learn about evolutionary game theory sometime around 2011 and 12, I kept getting all these interesting papers on multiplayer games where Chaitanya was the author along with Trollson and others. And so those motivated me to start working on game theory. So it's indeed a privilege and a pleasure to have him give these set of lectures at this meeting.
So, thanks a lot, Supratim, Sagar, and all. Actually, the organizers. That's a very kind introduction. I don't think I deserve that, so I'll try my best. Since I've been working on evolutionary game theory for some time now, and I always wanted to come back to India and give some talks within this community, and it was always very hard to find the community. So I'm extremely thankful to Supratim, Sagar, to actually have pushed to make this community happen actually at this point, and I'm very thankful for you for that, and yeah, all the best also, hopefully for pushing it further. So my name is Chaitanya, and I'm at the University of Würzburg, and during interactions with a lot of you already from last week, I know that this is going to be a talk which you will be like, okay, this is getting way too repetitive now, but I'll already try to make sure that you are actually at least not falling asleep due to this. If you do fall asleep, I'll blame it on the lunch because the food has been really great. I mean, who gives ras malai for lunch and then expects people to sit in the lecture after that awake? So I'll try my best to keep you awake. Also, during the last week, I had interactions with quite a few of you, and you asked me, what do I do actually, right? And so I decided, like, instead of starting directly with evolutionary multiplayer games, I'll talk a little bit of what I actually do in the group. And what the group is actually working on is dynamics of living systems. And it sounds very generic, very broad, so I'll try to be a bit more specific afterwards, like what does it actually mean? But as you all might know, you need to have some titles at some point to put something on your websites and stuff. So what we do try to focus on is fundamental processes to translational applications. And what do I mean by that? So when you look across the biological scales of life, like biological, sociobiological, or however you want to look at, you want to try to understand, once you go across it, what are the fundamental properties that are driving these systems at different scales, right? So if I look at a particular scale, and then I try to understand what are the underlying forces which are actually driving it, they might not always be the same, or they might not always have the same weights, right? I mean, I'm looking at a socio-biological system, and I might think that, okay, I don't really need to worry about the chemical interactions which are happening within that at that point, so that's a time scale which is out. But sometimes you do get feedbacks, right? We have a socio-ecological system, and then you have a pandemic, right? And then you need to kind of understand the rates of which that are being driven. So there are connections between them, but we need to understand the weights of those kind of underlying processes which drive. And that's what we try to do. And once we have a good enough understanding of that, then what we try to do is we leverage that understanding. We leverage it towards developing translational applications. I'll try to say what I mean by that. The research actually within the group is then more or less split between these three things. One is fundamental research. Another is this translational application, which I mentioned. And there is also a third thing, which is about the toolbox development, right? For fundamental applications, you can go across the scales. I see that the blue is really blue here, which wasn't the case actually on my screen, so I apologize for that. So you can go across the scales of organization and ask different questions, right, at different scales, as I mentioned, but you could also develop theories which are a bit more general, which go across them. So these are some of the topics that we do work on, and this is just to say that this is not all made up keywords, so we do have some things to back things up. So if you're interested, I can talk to you about specific topics later on, so just let me know. But the thing is, You also want to develop translational applications after that. But before going to the translational applications and what we actually do, there is a core shift that you need to have, right? As we actually heard in today morning's talks, when we go across these scales of organization, when developing translational applications, you're more on this right-hand side, right? You want to develop applications which have a societal impact at some point. And if you want to do that, you start from these more academic disciplines, which are very well siloed. But as soon as you develop discipline applications, you need to move out of those silos. And I think meetings like these and also developing applications in general forces you to go across scales, across disciplines. And I think that's something which is extremely essential if you do want to develop translational applications, because then you need to, again, giving the example of the pandemic, you don't need to just understand the biology, but you also need to understand people's behaviors. You need to understand how policymaking is happening, right? These are just some of the topics that we are interested in within the group. So we go from ecosystem engineering, which I think I will definitely not even bother mentioning because Sylvia might talk way more about it, and Wenyin should be around. She is also going to be talking about that. We try to understand the theories and try to apply them to Darwinian medicine, like approaches in medicine with a Darwinian perspective. Similar things you can do in agriculture as well. Having a Darwinian perspective in that brings in a lot more solutions to problems that we might have faced, and in conservation biology and policymaking. Again, these are just some of the works which you can follow up afterwards. I'm happy to discuss this. This is basically an advertisement, right? Because you asked me what I do, so there you go. So what we try to do is, as I said, like have these interactions, feedback interactions between fundamental, empirical, and theoretical work, right? And the translational fields of research. The fundamental research is split between these two, scale-specific and then scale-free. That's what I mentioned. Like scale-specific would mean you take a problem which is a well-known problem and try to understand that. Scale-free would be we try to develop a more or less general theory which you can then apply across these different scales of organization. But at the heart of this, as I mentioned, there was also this toolbox development, right? Because we are doing theory most of the times, we need to have an updated toolbox to use to apply these theories from. And depending on the different problems, sometimes you have to pick and choose your tools. Otherwise, you end up having this hammer, right? And everything looks like a nail. You still do that, of course, because you choose your favorite tools. But at least be aware of that, and when we do that, we use these kind of tools which are in our toolbox. And at the same time, we also try to develop those tools a bit, right? Because sometimes you see that, oh, this tool is there, but we can't really use it because it doesn't have the specific development within it. So we try to also do research within that to push what tools we have at our disposal. And then finally, we come to game theory, right? That's one of the tools that we have been using and the one that we have been developing. So that brings me back actually to this, and that also excuses me if I don't know things, right? So I already apologize to Jonathan if I'm making mistakes in the classical game theoretic frameworks, because we will be focusing totally on multiplayer evolutionary games, right? And also within that, I'm making some assumptions on the symmetric nature of the games, and within that, try to focus on replicator dynamics as much as possible, right? Now, we did hear a lot about two-player games like throughout last week, and there might be some repetition of that, but I'm hopefully trying to extend it to this multiplayer game framework and in a very slow manner. But if things are not clear, please let me know at any point, because I guess they should be clear, and I'll try my best to make them clear then, right? So the idea is, in the set of 3 lectures today, we will have an introduction to multiplayer evolutionary games, and weirdly, we will try to see how they are actually connected to classical models in population genetics. Not something that people often think about, but we will try our best and try to see how they connect. In the second lecture, we will try to look at the if, when, and how of these kind of games, and by that I mean we will do a bit more pedagogical exploration into the fixation probabilities, fixation times, the dynamics, the long-term dynamics of those multiplayer evolutionary games, right, in general. If time permits over there, then I would like to actually then use those methods that we have developed, right, and then show you how one can apply them to models of specifically here mutualism, or actually then I would also move into the direction of eco-evolutionary dynamics. Again, I would describe what all those things mean if things are not clear already, and also eco-evolutionary dynamics, I'm not really that worried if I miss that, because I'm just believing that Sylvia is covering those things. So I'm actually making use of the expertise which you got last week and the things that are going to be coming up this week and putting myself somewhere in between. So hopefully that works out. In the last lecture, though, I will try to move to some models in ecology very briefly of higher order interactions. And finally, we will then come to human decision making. So I would like to give you a flavor of how you can actually make use of evolutionary game theory across the different theoretical frameworks, right? So we have been discussing about evolutionary games or classical games as well in terms of human decision making. I know Supratim is very interested in that, so you have to bear with me a little bit until we get to the last lecture, so I'll come to that. Hopefully that answers also Sagar's question that how does it work in non-humans often. So hopefully we'll get that. So with this in mind, okay, let's start with the very first one and why multiplayer games. Because while reading the literature, again, a long time ago, I came across the statement by William Hamilton, like human life is a many-person game and not just a disjoint collection, right, of two-people games. Like we interact with a lot of people, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes one after the other, but it's rarely, like, unless designed as such in a pairwise manner, right, where we have to decide on one-on-one meetings, or we have interactions which are already by definition then one-on-one. So in that case, it does make sense to actually look at a many-person game. Again, to answer your query, it's not just about human life in that case, but you do see these examples across the tree of life, right? You have, we heard about interactions within bacteria, but then it's very hard to define them as a two-player game, actually. Like I mean, clearly it's an assumption, that's fine, it works a lot of times, but it's not, right? So how far can we basically stretch that assumption then in that case? Classical example in ants, so many bodies, species, and calling them as a superorganism can help us to describe dynamics at the level of that superorganism. But once you are within the colony level, there are different questions that come into play. Right? So how do we understand that as a multiplayer game? And the classical models of hunting, both in other animals and in humans, big game hunting has always been many player interactions. So you need to have strategies of those hunters, or basically players, to match each other and to make sure that all these different players are acting in the right manner to get some stuff done, right? Again, what we heard today morning about collaborations and all, so that's the idea. So we need multiple individuals actually to get together and to get things done properly. They do say that organizing this conference was very hard to do, but then I was discussing also earlier that most of the work was done by these two, but so it's not still like that. I think there are more people involved, and I believe that. So it is always a multiplayer game in that sense. So we will try to understand these games, but we will try to build them up, right, from the two-player interactions that we have been hearing about since last week. For the people who actually know all of this thing, please bear with me. For people who don't know this thing, I hope you find it a bit exciting. But we will split this whole title, Multiplayer Evolutionary Games, into these three words. Actually, we will look at what do I mean by evolutionary, what do I mean by evolutionary games, and then what do I mean by multiplayer evolutionary games, right? So let's start very simple with what do I mean by actually evolutionary in this sense, at least. So we do look at, for example, the units of selection, right? So looking at this very famous paper by Lewontin, he defined there are these three processes which a system kind of needs to have so that it can be subject to evolutionary process, right? And the three things he kind of mentions are there should be different individuals in the population. They should have different morphologies, physiologies, and behaviors, right? So there should be some kind of a phenotypic variation. Now, I'm used to giving talks to mostly audiences in biology, and they all come about and give talks about their favorite model organisms. And then I also go on and say that that's basically my model organism, and that's what I work with. So they are very amiable, very well behaved in the lab. They have all the very nice features of a model organism. So those little dots, right? So we do have them already having some morphological variation. There is phenotypic variation within them. The second thing is those different phenotypes should have different rates of survival and reproduction in different environments. So they should have some amount of differential fitness, right? So these two types need to have some difference in their fitness. You could also not have it, but of course then the dynamics would proceed. Maybe it might not be subject to evolutionary selection. right? So it needs to have some kind of differential fitness. And the last thing which you mentioned is that there should be some kind of a correlation between parents and offspring, right? So let's look at very simple processes. You have reproduction and mutations. So your reproduction with some fidelity, which would give you, a red gives you red individuals, blue gives you blue individuals, and that kind of gives me some kind of a guarantee. If I see a red individual, it comes from a red individual. If you do have mutations on it, the assumption here would be they need to be low enough so that at least you can still believe in the fact that up to a certain level of expectation, you can say that the red individuals come from red individuals with this given correction term, right, of mutation. If you have constant mutations, then things get messy. Again, no selective effect will kind of take place, because as soon as someone is reproducing, they might make the other type with some probability. Right? So there are some assumptions on the mutation rates that you can make, but the idea is you need to be able to track heredity in some way from parents to offsprings. Right? There have been updates to this. I mean, this has been there for quite a long time. There have been updates to this theory. There have been updates to what actually constitutes an evolutionary process. What are the ingredients of a well-functioning evolutionary process? Do we focus on individuals? Do we focus on communities? Do we focus on functions? So there have been a lot of updates and variations to this thing, and I'm happy to discuss more of them with you later on. For the sake of this lecture, this is enough for now, okay? But I just wanted to make a clarification that these things can be different, actually. With this, actually, these are just the basic ingredients that we will put in our model, right, which will work on this population. And let's see where we go with it. Well, where we go with it is quite straightforward, right? So we do have this mixed population over here, and if I do say that this is the fitness profile, you might have a pretty good guess where things go, right? And that will be towards the, exactly, right? So you have some kind of an evolutionary process on top of it, and you will move towards the red side, right? And that's what is kind of expected. Like if you have this static fitness landscape, right, where things are not really changing, the red type has a bigger fitness than the blue type. Over time, the population will move to a fitness peak. So this was just the fitness bar chart, which I showed was just a single trait. This is in 2 dimensions. The traits are split, and the idea is then you see this peak of fitness landscape, and the population will just climb to that fitness peak. Is this okay? It's extremely simple so far, I hope. Nothing complicated. Cool. Perfect. Okay, so this is done about the evolution part, and I'll just stop over there for now because I want to go talk about evolutionary games, actually, right? If you try to look at the history for evolutionary games, then where did this kind of concept come from? Interestingly, I mean, you're not supposed to read this much more in detail. This is for me to read. You can read this. So this is publication by Ronald Fisher, and this was from 1958, where he mentioned that, okay, I have been having discussions with Dr. Cavalli, and he actually suggested that if we want to understand the complexities in ecology, what we need to look for is to use the analogy of games of skill, or to speak somewhat more pretentiously of the theory of games, right? And then he goes on to say that how 20 years ago, he actually worked on a card game, the analysis of a card game, Leher. And then after that, he saw that, oh, there were these 2 people, von Morgan, von Neumann, and Morgenstern over here, who have actually been written down this book on the theory of games and in economic behavior, right, 1944. So he actually then cites them retrospectively that, oh yeah, then they followed it up. The thing is, this was just mentioned in passing in 1958, but actually then Lewontin, again, he wrote a massive paper actually talking about evolution and the theory of games. Just put it together. But we don't usually cite this, right, when we want to talk about evolutionary game theory, typically. So there is a reason why we don't. Do you guys know why? Well, not know as in like this is terrible work, this is great stuff, of course, but this doesn't constitute the evolutionary game theory as we know of today, at least. And the reason for that is that these guys missed like a certain few things. But first of all, they focused on species, right? They focused on species and species interactions and ecologies, which is a slightly different mindset when we want to talk about evolutionary games within a population. I will come back to this actually much later in the lecture series point, but for now this is enough to say that they actually focused on slightly different level of biological organization, again, just as we were looking at before. And that actually creates some problems in the interpretation of evolutionary games. Secondly, they were missing actually a crucial component of evolutionary games as we know of today, which is being used, is that of frequency dependence, right? And I know that this is a terrible thing to do. It's the second week in which you have been listening to all talks about game theory, but I will, just to stress the importance of all of this, of the frequency dependence, we will actually look back at this method and see what happens, right, when you do include frequency dependence. And one way of including it is that you have a fitness which is not static anymore, right? Now fitness is not static, so if you are very close to this end, let's say, for example, the blue get an advantage, right? Let's say when you move very close to this end, the red get an advantage. And we have already seen the simplex, right? So the dynamics actually proceeds on this one-dimensional simplex because there are only two types in the population, the red and the blue, right? So if we are over here where there are no blue, that means by definition everyone's red, or on the other side everyone is blue. But we know where the dynamics will go, right, in such kind of a system. Yes? Yes. It does lead to coexistence, right, and of the two types. And visualizing this dynamic fitness landscape can be a bit of a problematic, so let's try to do more of a social experiment. And I think, how many of you over here know of the beauty contest? And by I mean the Keynesian beauty contest. So of course a few, so please don't participate. But the idea over here is that you can choose a number, right, from 0 to 100. And the idea is you have to choose a number which is not just your favorite number, but the number which is closest to, let's say, half of the mean of the group. So you all will choose some numbers, this distribution will have some mean, but the winner is the one who gets the number which is closest to half of that mean, right? But the thing is, there are two assumptions to make. First thing is you want to win, because otherwise you break the game. So you want to win the game. And the second one is like you think that at least your compatriots are at least as smart as you are, right? So with these kind of reasonings that you might have, right, being rational beings, what are some of the numbers that you might choose? So, sorry? You chose 0, yeah? There was someone else I heard? 1. Right, but I guess what was the argument for 1? You do keep on making it smaller, and since you could choose numbers all the way from 0, you might also push it all the way down to 0. So that's exactly the argument, right? Because you always try to halve the means in your head and thinking that others will do the same thing. That's what you get with this Keynesian beauty contest. The idea behind that was that he used another analogy to explain his game, saying that there are these images of people being published in a newspaper, and you have to pick the person's image, which is not what you think is the most preferable to your standards of beauty, but what you think most of the population would think. And that's the reason the name stuck. It has nothing to do with that. But that was a social context, right? We could also think of this in a biological context. And we actually heard a few examples. Does anyone remember a few? Or that definitely is one. Let's try to keep it even more simpler. And rock paper scissors is like a bit tricky because that's also an analogy of a biological system. So you could actually think of like the tail lengths, right? And this keeps it again simple. You have a smaller tail length of the peacock, the train of the peacock, or you could have them very long trains. And there are benefits and costs to both of these kind of traits, right? I mean, you could have a short train, but then actually sexual selection will actually drive you to have longer and longer train lengths. But we do not see such Fisherian runaway selection. You don't see extremely long tails because, on the other hand, you do have ecological selection, which pushes for slightly smaller tail lengths, right? Because it's very hard to fly, it's very hard to run away from predators, so at some point, the benefits of mating are going to be balanced off by actually the costs of being predated upon. So again, you see some kind of a system over here where you have decreasing fitness of the red and increasing fitness of the blue, right? And if you just put some numbers just in case, oh, okay, this is moving too fast. But anyways, if you put just some numbers, right, in that setting, then what you get is basically the payoff matrix. So you really want to know what's a nice thing to have in a population which is, say, mostly of small tail lengths, then it's good to have a slightly larger one. But if the whole population is made out of everyone who has large tail lengths, maybe actually there might be some benefit in actually having a smaller tail length, right? And now this is an example which also leads to a coexistence game between the two types, right? Because you just look at the payoff entries and this will tell you, okay, everyone is blue, good to do red, everyone is red, good to do blue. And this is again because we have assumed what I said before about the symmetry in the games, right? That's why we are not writing it down for the column player. This was just the biological interpretation of this, but to actually show it, then again in an abstract manner, this is what you have as a dynamic fitness landscape, right? You have a population which is trying to chase the peak, but the thing is, it's very hard for it to chase the peak because as soon as it moves on this landscape, it changes the landscape, right? The fitnesses itself are changing because of the movement of the population. And that's why the population never stays at a peak, but actually moves to the next one because it has reduced the peak just by being there. Maynard Smith actually characterized this as this being evolutionary game theory. He said evolutionary game theory is a way of thinking about evolution at the phenotypic level when the fitnesses of particular phenotypes depend on their frequencies, right? Again, there are some edits to this and we will come back to this again. So for now, this is kind of like the working definition that people have been using for evolutionary games, right? You have frequency dependence and you kind of have some dependent movement of the population because of that. We studied a very specific case here, the example which was of negative frequency dependence, but you could have different variations in this. Do you have any questions so far? Because this was about games and evolutionary games. So that was actually all about it. No? Things are clear or things are sleepy?
Yeah, one thing, since you were talking about a little bit of history of the name of evolutionary games and all that, I found it always surprising that Maynard Smith's book has not a single mention of Nash equilibrium.
Yeah.
Was this purposeful or?
No, apparently he did not read enough. No, that's literally documented, that as if because he did not read enough through, and that's also kind of the general where we get evolutionarily stable strategies and yes, the ESS concept basically, because he did not write it down as a refinement because he did not know that was a refinement. Peter Hammerstein, later on, he informed Maynard Smith why it is very well connected to the Nash equilibrium, actually. At least that's what his argument is. Or that's what Peter Hammerstein says Maynard Smith's argument is. Yeah, please. It's really great that you actually saw that, because the way that particular animation has been implemented, the coupling actually between the two is something which is coupling between the feedback between the population state and the fitness, so the environment state, is actually a tunable parameter. That's what they were playing with. So that was the work done by Randy Olson and Bjorn Ostman, I think, from the AI labs, and they were playing around with what different possibilities are. But that's actually true. There is a lag, right? There is a lag in there. If they were moving very fast, you would just find them in one place, right? But otherwise, yeah. So there is a lag there because they had some amount of decoupling between how fast does the environment respond to this change in frequencies. Yeah. But since we want to have a tight coupling with the fitness and with the frequencies, it wouldn't look like exactly like that, but it's a very good enough picture to explain what we mean by it. Right. No. Okay. Okay. So then we will try to start complicating things, right? Like let's look at multiplayer games. So we did look at quite a bit of two-player games, which were focused on, let's say, two-player interactions where we do have kind of information about the other players, that there is one. But in this case, now we are trying to move from two to multiple players. So in essence, something like moving from chess to poker, but I know that there are many more differences between chess and poker. Not focusing on those ones. Let's just look at the number of players, right? So we have increasing the number of players now. And how do we do that, right? How do we build up on the number of players? Because a lot of work actually has gone into two-player games with two strategies. There's a lot of theory which we know of in two-player games and two strategies for very good reason. It's always a good place to start, right? Starting simple is always a very good place to start. You know very well what will happen in those interactions. You have a 2x2 game where we have this very nice payoff matrix, which is written down, and we know everything that we want to know about interactions then within this payoff matrix. I've written the entries in a certain manner, but so let me just quickly explain the entries. So the payoff of these blue and the red, so they are separated out by A and B, right? And then the subscript, it just counts the number of A individuals that you're interacting with, right? So this just says I'm interacting with 0 blue individuals for A. This one says I'm interacting with, so one says I'm interacting with 1 blue individual, right? And it's B for, because that's the second pair. So that's just the way, one way of reading it, okay? But the thing is, not everyone always started this simple. Like Jonathan mentioned us from the times when it was possible to write down small papers. This is the one-page paper by John Nash, right, from the 1950s, where he actually, already at that point, he mentioned that this work is on equilibrium points in n-person games. Actually, he followed it up very quickly, also submitting by the end of that year, another paper which what we know of, like on non-cooperative games, and the full analysis of that, because he already moved in this manuscript, he moved to actually poker, analyzed poker in this game, in this paper, a 3-player poker game. And he very nicely started the whole thing already with saying that, Morgenstern and von Neumann have this very nice book written down. It's about 2-player games which are cooperative in nature. I'm going to be moving on to non-cooperative games with any number of players, right? I think that's a pretty bold and brilliant way to start, actually. In that same spirit, not everyone could actually start with this, because I think we want to include evolutionary processes also into this mix. Things become very complicated, but we could at least try to start like step by step, right? So we know quite a bit about these 2-player games with 2 strategies. Let's forget about multiple strategies, at least try to see if we can extend it to multiple players, right? So we had written this thing down before, we know how to read it, and just to change again the representation of this payoff matrix, I'm going to write it down like this, right? So on the x-axis, you have player 1. On the y-axis, you have player 2, right? And you go from blue to red as you move along that axis, right? That's one representation of this, of the payoff entries. Let's move that to the left-hand side. And now what we want to do is we want to construct a 3-player game with 2 strategies on this. So we want to add a 3rd player, right, to this. So we have already used the 2 of the axes. So there is a natural way of including the 3rd player, right? Which would be? Exactly. You just put one more axis and then put an individual on that axis, right? And that would be the 3rd one. Now we have a 2x2x2 game. That's what you would call it, right? Because now, going by this notation, we have 8 entries to fill. From each of these axes, as we move away, we see that one of the individuals have changed their strategies, right? So there are 3 of those. Making one more step, now the 2 of the individuals have changed their strategies, right? Until we get to the point where all of them are playing the red strategy. Is this fine? Okay, all right. But the thing is, this kind of notation actually makes sense if the identities of the players matter, right? We know that this woman over here has changed her strategy. We know that the stick man has changed his strategy over here. And that's what allows us to write down these 3 different axes. right? Because we are following a certain individual or as they move along this axis. From this individual's point of view, if the identities of the players do not matter, right? Let's say identity of one of them matters. Let's say the woman over here, she's looking at her co-players, but she can't really tell the difference, right, between the two of them. So from her point of view, actually this plane over here is the only thing that matters. And in that plane, these two strategies look the same. These two actually payoffs would look the same because from her point of view, only one other individual, right, is playing red. Does that make sense? Exactly, right? That's what you are just looking for, right? As a blue individual over here, she's then in this plane, and then she looks like what my partners are doing, not what each one of them is doing separately. In general, what the group looks like, right? And that group, one of them is playing red. That would be these two options. Yep, that's okay. But the thing is, this happens for all of them, right? Each one of them could do the same kind of argumentation. That from their point of view, maybe only they want to take into account how many of those other individuals that you're playing with have switched their strategy, right? So that means either you look at the bottom over here, or for the third player, then it would just be the face. For how many of you is the face pointing towards you, or is it away from you? Is it towards you? For the third player. And for how many is it away from you? It's curious. I mean, it has nothing to do with this. I'm always fascinated when I give this talk. Like because just the way you put those diagonals, if the diagonals are the other way around, many people think that it's in the back. But I don't know why. I mean, probably people must have studied this very well. So, because there is no particular reason why it should be, right? But okay. Anyways, besides, that's nothing to do with this. The point is, from each individual's point of view, it would look like, okay, what the group composition is, and if that's only the thing I care about, on top of that, we are actually saying that we are dealing with symmetric games, right? That's what we wanted to actually start with. And if we do that kind of an assumption that we want to stick with symmetric games, where I actually don't really care exactly which other individual has switched their strategy, we don't need to write down all of these payoff entries, actually, right? Because then we can actually reduce this thing. We just look at the proportions, right, of the number of individuals who are playing a different strategy, and I can write all of that down into a payoff matrix-like structure. So here, now I guess the subscripts kind of make sense, right? Because now you only look at how many of your co-players have switched their strategies or have different strategies, right? Here, none of them play blue, one of them plays blue, and both of them, they play blue, right? Is there any confusion at this point? Is it obvious why there is this 2 here? Okay, 1, 2, 3 people, it's obvious. Or it's obvious. Okay. So the 2 is because you don't really know which one of them has switched, right? So it's just a combinatorial possibility that it could be the first or the second, right? So you have to take care of this combinatorial possibility, and that's why you need to have a weight of 2 at that point, right? And this is what we have written down, is basically then a 3-player game with 2 strategies. Sorry? It's a symmetric game, again, yep, 3-player game with 2 strategies, symmetric. If it's not symmetric, you deal with this object, right? So the analysis that we are doing actually, so some of the results that I'll show you today and tomorrow, they are actually valid for this object. But the thing is to keep it easier, because as you can see, you increase the number of dimensions. Things blow up very quickly. You don't want to do that, and that's why you actually try to convert it back so that at least it is amenable when you want to discuss about these things. In principle, if you have specific examples where you need to include this, then you still can, because you know where A to A1 came from, right? So we can actually then split A1 up into its constituents when the need arises. Okay, so if this part is clear, then actually this should be immediately straightforward. So you can actually increase the number of players as much as you want, but what happens is that for a D-player game with 2 strategies, you come up with this object, right, which goes from 0 number of blue players, so all D minus 1 of them would be red, or all D minus 1 of them would be blue, right? And in between, you get these entries which need to be weighted by the number of combinations that you will get in between. So there will be, if you don't have this reduction possible, then actually that will be a tensor of D dimensions, right? In each dimension you have of size 2, because we are still dealing with 2 strategies over here. Right? Is this part fine? Okay. If there are any questions, if something is not clear, please let me know. But I think we are going pretty slow and there is no rush actually in that sense. What about multiple strategies, right? So we did talk about multiple players, but let's try to see if we can generalize this even more. Right? So we did talk about 2-player games now with multiplayer games with 2 strategies. Now let's see what happens if you have any number of strategies. Right? So we want to move into this space on the x-axis now and see if we can extend what we have over here for multiple players to multiple strategies as well. But increasing multiple strategies you have already seen, right? We talked about rock, paper, scissors right now. That has 3 strategies, right? We started simple only with 2, but putting it in a 3rd strategy should be quite easy in this formulation, right? On each of these points, we had the different strategies, blue, red, or you can just add a 3rd one, right? So you just extend this structure by 1 more, and then you get the 3rd strategy. So all you have done is you have increased the size of the matrix in this case. There's nothing to do with the dimensions right now, right? Increasing the strategies, you would increase the size of the matrix. But now, if we want to take this object and add the 3rd player, you already know what we have to do now, right? We need to add 1 more player to the z-axis, and that would make this as a cube again, and with a lot more entries that we need to fill, right? And you could do the same kind of argumentation as we did for the with the 2 strategy case, right? There are some similarities within these payoffs that one needs to work through, which you only look at like what my co-players, what my group looks like. And if you make those kind of arguments, again, making arguments for symmetry, then actually, if as I mentioned, the identity of players matters, then you deal with this object. But again, to keep things simple, if I want to write down the object, yeah.
Should there have been 3 layers?
There should have been 3 layers. You're right, right? There is 1 more actually going behind. You're totally right. Yeah, it's not a cube right now. No. There are even more objects to fill. Thank you. So there are 3, right? In front or in back? Somewhere. I don't know. But there are 3, right? So there are 3 layers. And we need to fill that whole object, and that's problematic. Instead of writing it down as this cube, which okay, if you're used to dealing with multiple dimensions and their representations, this is fine. We have good tools at hand to do that, so we just write this down, right, like this. These would be the entries of that full tensor, right, where you actually take into account what each one of those individual players would do when they switch their strategies, and this is what it would look like, right? But the thing is, we don't want to work with this, because again, this would make sense if all those individuals have their identities, right? To make our lives easier, let's say that no, we don't worry about this thing. We look at the case when the identities do not matter, and again, you have reduced the number of payoffs, right? You have reduced the number of payoffs, but what comes, no such thing as a free lunch, so that's why you get these weights on top, right? You have reduced the values of entries we reduce the number of entries over here, but then each one of these entries, for example, they count for twice. Each one of these, they count for twice, because you don't know which exact player is the one who has switched the strategy, right? Yeah.
So when you call it a tensor, usually we talk about transformation rules.
It's not that one. No, no, this is just a high dimensional vector. Yeah.
It's a hypermetric.
Yes, exactly. It's not that, but yeah, that's true. Yeah. Here you have to kind of extend the notation a little bit for the subscripts, because now you want to track all the, you could track just two of them because then you know the third in a way, but you don't actually want to lose information in this case right now because it's just for representation. So here it just tells you how many number of blue, how many number of red, and how many red, blue, and yellow, right, are there in your group. And they can be anything from, again, D-1, right? Because you are one of the players and you are playing with two other players. So that's why it's a 3-player game still with 3 strategies. Now, is this part okay? All right, yeah, yes. Sorry? Yeah. Yeah. Ah, good catch. That's the wrong one. So this should be blue, red. That's why when I said blue first, because that's what I was thinking of, but I guess then I read it, this is wrong. It should be blue, red, yellow, right? Yeah. All right.
So when you read the previous matrix, then there was no assumption. Now you are taking assumption that symmetry assumption.
No, that was also there, right? For the three.
The previous matrix.
For the 3-player. Just for this one.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, right? Because this I was trying to represent all the entries which might be here actually. Exactly, because in principle you can work with this matrix. That's my point. Because if you don't want to make that assumption, all you need to do is work with this matrix. And that's possible. So the results that we have are valid for actually this. But you could then make things simpler, because then every time you need to construct this matrix, it's easier to construct a matrix which has slightly less number of entries, but you offload your complexity into the calculation of the payoffs. And, yeah.
Lastly, when we add 2 strategies, there is only one subscript, like A,
Right.
I.
Yeah.
We also can do with just 2 subscripts.
Yeah, that's what I said. So you could actually just do it with 2 because you know what the third one would be. Yeah. So in principle, I'm just trying to make it for complete. We don't really use it. It's fine. Okay. Yep. No more questions over here. That should be fine. So just to summarize this part, actually what happens when we added a new strategy to the game, actually it didn't do anything much to the complexity of the payoff matrix, except for making it bigger, right? We made the matrix bigger, but the dynamics actually still takes place for 2 strategies on this one-dimensional simplex, but for 3 strategies, then you increase the dimensionality of this simplex, right? Because now we need to deal with it in this triangle. Should I explain this triangle again? Because I think many speakers have explained the triangle before, right? Yeah, I think so. I think the silence means yes in this case. But if not, I'm happy to, okay? True. No, but if you want explanation, because yeah, you have added one more strategy, you need to track that one, right? So you need have an S minus 1 dimensional object to track that. And that's what happens when you add a strategy, right? But if you add a player, actually, your simplexes remains the same because you might be still tracking just 2 strategies. If you're 3, you're just tracking the same 3 strategies. What is happening is that your complexity is being added to the payoff matrix itself, right? The payoff matrix becomes a bit more complex, right? You have increased the dimensionality of your payoff matrix. And that's what's happening when you add a new player to the strategy space. That's neat. It's just representations and pictures and pretty images, but what can we actually do with this, right? So where do we use it in any case? So the thing is, that was actually going back to the first part of the lecture, which was about the introduction. And this is like a simple setup of how you construct very simple multiplayer games, right? And that's what we dealt with right now. You can make these things infinitely complex as much as you want, but as a for initial building block, I think this should be fine. If this is not clear, please let me know, right? But once we have this, what do we do with it now? And we actually will see that how this actually connects to some classical models of in population genetics, which is a thing I hope not many people have done before. Has anyone thought about this connection? No? Okay, all right. That's good and bad for me as well. That's good because I can talk about something which is new. It's bad because, oh no, so no one read any of the stuff which was buried somewhere in the manuscript, which happens all the time. So that's why this is the nice occasion for me to talk about it actually. So let's actually move to the use of this thing, right? And let's move to a little bit of slightly different topic than what we have been discussing for the last week. And I want to talk a bit about this. Has anyone seen these kind of representations before in school, I guess, or early college works? Yeah, but not everyone remembers it, I would say. So, okay. Yep, you have a question? No, okay, right.
You're talking about ABCD or the
All. I think we have bigger problems here. Right, we are talking about the 3 different genotypes, capital A and small a, which constitute the 3 different genotypes in a diploid organism, where you have the 2 alleles, which are both capital A's, a capital A and small a heterozygote, or a small a homozygote, right? And usually, if you have kind of some simple traits which can be defined by these, that's what these are trying to represent. These are trying to represent the traits of those genotypes, then, which you might see in the end. And as we talked about before, it would be interesting if they have different fitnesses, right? And what we are trying to write down here are the fitnesses alpha, beta, and gamma as the fitnesses of these 3 different genotypes. That part is fine. Yeah, those are just 3 different genotypes of a diploid organism for a gene on a single locus, which has 2 alleles, A, capital A, and small a, right? The homozygotes have fitness alpha and gamma. The heterozygote has a fitness beta. Again, just to repeat it, right? That's fine. Now the thing is, these are diploid organisms, they are mating, right? On the row, do you have a question? No. Okay. On the row, we have the 3 different genotypes, again being represented, and they might interact with another individual, right, who's being represented by the columns, right? Now, when they interact, there is a probability of having offspring, and what's the probability of an offspring of a certain genotype being made? And that's what we are tracking over here, right? That's the famous Punnett square and the offspring being made by the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium conditions, to which both Hardy was like extremely unhappy that why is his name being ascribed to a binomial sampling, but that's a different story. So the argument over here is you have an individual who has capital A, who mates with another individual who has the genotype capital A, A. So the all possible offsprings which are possible with this mating are capital A, right? They all will have fitness alpha, right? Straightforward. The thing is, if you do have matings, for example, capital A, small a, mating with another capital A, small a, right? Then you have, say, 1/4 of the individuals, which might be homozygote, capital A. You have 1/4 of the individuals, which might be homozygote for small a. And then half of the other proportions would be the heterozygotes, capital A, small a. And that's how you read this whole matrix, right? Is that now a bit more clear, right? Okay. There is an assumption. Yeah, please. Is there? Which one, please? Let me know, because I still have to upload the slides, so I will fix them. This one? Yeah, okay. This one. Capital A. That's right. That's what it should be. And I get to fix that now. So the one which you might download from the website, hopefully that has the corrected version. Thanks a lot. Yeah. This is extremely useful to have all the corrections, because these will be important later on actually. What I will use, because all of this thing that I talked about, it actually happens only half the time, right? And why is that? Because there is also an assumption being made in this case. All right. What's the, yeah? Yeah, but this whole matrix is actually happening only half the time. And that's because what we did not talk about are the sexes, right? We did not talk about the sexes because if you have sexes, then they will switch the matrix, because half the time everyone on the rows are males, but half the time all the rows are also females. So you have to switch the roles between who's the row player, is that a male or a female, and the other way around, right? So you could actually think of it that this whole thing happens half the time, and the other half the time but then it is symmetric, and that's why we are not writing it down. Right? Those are the assumptions which actually go in the calculation of these kind of classical models, which we don't explicitly state many times, and that's basically, if you take anything out from this talk, is that looking at the assumptions again and again, and making those assumptions clear of those models is extremely important.
But if you bring sex and all those things, then these fitnesses are to be interpreted as what?
I'll come to that.
Okay.
I'll come to that, exactly. Well, first, let's try to write down the fitnesses actually in. And for that, I would suggest a slightly different point of view now, right? What we could do is actually we could look at this in a slightly different manner. Let's say we actually, because in an evolutionary process, what do we want to follow, right? We want to follow the change in the gene frequency over time. Over time, how does the gene frequency change? So then let's look at the gene frequency, right? But in a slightly different manner. Here, let's say each allele, say capital A, right, is with its one other partner in the same individual. Right? It's a diploid organism, so as an allele, there will be another allele in the same individual. Right? On top of that, that allele, or that individual rather than in that case, will also interact with another individual, which we had over here, right? Which also has two other alleles. Right? So from that one focal allele's point of view, let's say if this is the one, from that focal allele's point of view, there are three other alleles. Right? One which is within the same partner, and two which will come from the other partner. Right? So let's say there is this focal allele over here, and this capital A is in the same partner, and then it interacts with small a as coming from the other partner. Right? It could also be possible that you have these other pairings, right? Because I might be actually together with a small a, and then the partner is actually capital A, small a, and the other way around, because there are three other individuals, we are tracking the identities in this case, right? Is it the yellow or the blue, small? That might make a difference. So just to keep it general, let's track it from the beginning, right? And if this is the case, then I ask the question, in the offspring, the A allele appears with what fitness? Right? You ask a slightly different question in this case. So in the offspring that you will get with this kind of mating, capital A, small a, you could just look that up. That's here, right? So all the offspring are heterozygotes over here. So the fitness of the A allele, so there are 4 A alleles which are being seen in this one, right? What's the distribution of those 4 alleles, and with what weights are they being represented? Well, they are being represented equally. All of them have the same fitness, right, of beta in that case, right? Because that's the fitness of the heterozygote. That's beta. But if you do the same thing with capital A small a and capital A small a, so you look back up there, capital A small a, that's here, right? So how many A alleles do you see, capital A alleles, in total? Right? There are 4? No? There are 4 capital A alleles, right? Out of those 4, half of them have the same fitness, which is of alpha, and half of them have the fitness of beta, right? We are just looking at the population of A alleles and looking at the proportions of them which appear with what fitness. It's not the fitness of A allele by itself, no? It's the fitness of the genotype that they appear in, but you want to only look at the alleles then within that. So that's the way of that's the nuanced version of looking at it, right? That's the different way of looking at it. And if you do it like that, then this is the fitness that you get, right? So it's alpha plus beta by 2, because in both cases they just appear half the times. Is this part clear? Actually, if I'm not Making myself clear, please let me know. Okay, all right. Since this case is the same, basically, but with a different identity, it just appears again, right? Alpha plus beta by 2, right? At that specific, how many times is being represented, basically, at that time, right? Yep. I think it's served first. Yeah, please. Sorry? But here we do, right? Right, right. No, good question. This was an example where you have this as a focal allele which has these 3 partners, as an example, right? You're totally right. I mean, in principle, we should look at that, right? But let's walk through one of these examples, just one of these examples, and we'll answer your question, actually, on the next slide, right? Because with this, what we have is we are following only this capital A allele right now in this one particular interaction scheme with these partners. Sorry? If it shows up in the offspring, right? And that's what we have here. If it shows up in the offspring, that's what we want to look at. In the offspring, how is it being represented? If it's being represented as a capital A homozygote, then you would have a fitness of alpha. That's what we looked over here. It does appear as alpha, but only half the times. Half the times it is beta, right? Yeah. If you do this, just rewriting it over here, again, the same thing. But there are 3 of these, right? Just what we did before, you need to correct for these combinatorics, right? So there are 3 possible outcomes. We just make sure that we divide these possible outcomes by 3. And if you simplify this thing, it's even better, alpha plus 2 beta by 3, sure. And now we answer your question. Sorry, just a minute. Sylvia had a question earlier. That was the same. Okay, okay, all right. But then to answer your questions, that was one particular interaction, right? You could actually say that this is what it is, right? Because that was the interaction which happened when you considered only one other capital A. Now you could consider what happens when there are 2 capital A's, right? And when you consider that all your other partners are all capital A's, things like that. But once you do that, you have to go through these combinatorics so that you calculate each one of these, A0, A1, A2, A3s, and B0, B1, B2, B3s. You have to go through that same calculation machinery to get what those A1s look like in the end. Is this part clear or not? Sorry, could you? Yeah. This combination. Which one?
Basically, the question is, what is it in words?
Right, so.
A1, A0, A2, A3. Put it in a nice sentence.
Yeah. So this would mean that all of these are the fitnesses of those particular alleles, which you would get as offsprings when you have interactions with these partners. And your partners are either within, one of them could be within you, because you're individual, and then you play that game with the other 2 alleles. And that's exactly. So with that mating, which is happening with a combination of these 4 elements, the offspring fitness of that A allele will be A1. Yeah. Yes.
Are you collapsing the question of gender into your matrix now? Like, because I don't see.
Good question, because we didn't talk about it, right? Because that was a symmetric thing. We did not consider the sexes. I just mentioned they would be half the times, right? So if we want to consider that in this already, we would say that all of this thing, half the times is alpha plus 2 beta by 3, plus half the times it is alpha plus 2 beta by 3, because right now we are considering symmetric things. So right now it's collapsed in there, right? Yeah. Please. Yes, exactly. Yeah, but it's being weighted because those are the proportion of individuals and things like that, right? Yeah, but that's taken care of, right? Already in the combinatorics, right? Yeah, yeah. Yes, yes. That's true. That's more succinct than what I said, so maybe that's more useful. Yeah. It's not, so the proportions, that's what. So proportions in the next. Yeah. There was a question by you? No. No. There's no other question, right? Okay. Okay. So that's how we actually write this. We want to calculate these entries, and actually when you can go through the same exercise, right? And then you get this. And what this one is a 4-player game, right? With 2 strategies, actually. So what we have done is we have actually written down the classical population genetic things, right? Of going from one generation to the next generation, which is what we are interested in, as a 4-player game with 2 strategies because we are considering 2 alleles in this case. Genotypes. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Has the offspring, and the proportion of the offsprings which will have the fitnesses determined by their genotypes will be this. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. 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 Please, Sylvia. Yeah. Right. So the colors was for combinatorics. No, of the same kind, yes. That's a good question. I will come to that. So in classical arguments, you would not make a difference, right, between that. In population genetics, you would not make a difference because they are the same. It's all that matters is it small a, and then you don't care if the small a is on the which chromosome. If that matters, then that formulation is useful. Then this formulation actually would be useful, right? Because then you would say that, okay, A1 is the allele which is occurring on this one particular chromosome, but you could have the same allele but appearing on a different chromosome. Then that might have some different issues, and if they might have some different fitnesses, and if they have a different fitness, then this formulation will take care of that. Then it will be a different matrix, or you could actually, the matrix will be the same, the entries here would differ. Yeah, the matrix will be the same. Yeah, your entries, the calculation of the entries would change. Yeah. Exactly, you could, yeah. Precisely. Then we run into the same issues where the position matters, where the identity matters. And that's why we looked at the games where the identity matters. So you could write down a matrix which is much more bigger. The reason we could write it down like this is because you already have the assumptions of combinatorics in there. If the positions matter, if the identities matter, then you can do these combinatorics, right? So this is for doing this. But this is really good that you asked, because that's why even going through this whole machinery, because we have made those assumptions, actually something peculiar happens over here, right? So we have written down this 4-player game over here, and let me write down the average payoffs, right, of this now. So these are the exact payoffs that you get, right? But we need to write down the average payoffs. We have never written down the average payoffs so far for multiplayer games right now over here. So let's, like, general terms, they would be like, so for the average payoff of A, not particularly A in this case, but it would just be in general, one, right? And then you have this binomial, x to the k, x to the d minus 1 minus k, times, then you have a k, right? Right? That makes sense? And so this is because this takes care of your combinatorics, right? This tells you the product, that how many individuals you're, what type you're interacting with, and the combinatorics of that, right? If you're interacting with 0 K types, 0 blue types, or 0 A types in this case, right? Then K is 0, and that would just tell me that you're interacting with a D minus 1 red player, or blue players, sorry, these small a's. Does that make sense? So this would just be the combinatorics for that, of writing down the average payoffs. So if you put D equal to 2, what you would just get is x plus 1 minus x, weighted by those payoff entries, right? Because that would just be the case for a 2-player game, where D is equal to 2, D is the number of players. Does that make sense? Because if your D is equal to 2, you end up with A1x plus A0, 1 minus x, right? With this. And we know this representation already. For a 3-player game, you would get A2 x squared plus twice A1 x 1 minus x plus A0 1 minus x squared, right? It's this simple binomial which is being weighted by the payoffs, right? That's just the general formulation for this. Now we did it for a 4-player game. I would expect something much more complex, right, here. So this is for 2, this is for 3, and then you get 4, which is a cubic term. I write this down and simplify, and this is what you get, right? Now, the reason it simplifies and you get this is because all the assumptions that we have been talking about. We have been talking about the symmetric payoff matrices, we have been talking about random mating, we have been talking about no different fitnesses because of the positions, and because of all those assumptions which we have put in there, all of this leads us to a linear form, which actually can be expressed as a 2-player game, right? Because then the expression is just alpha x plus beta 1 minus x, which are the alpha and beta, the entries of the payoff matrix. And beta and gamma would be the payoff of the entries of the payoff matrix for the second allele. Capital A. Sorry, I didn't mention, should have started with that. Please. Like all the assumptions. Yeah. All the assumptions with that. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, like exactly. So doing all those assumptions, which would also be this. This would be actually, this reminded me very much of your talk, like how do you do the sampling matters in this case. If it's random, this is what you get. If it would be something else, yeah, that would be different. So, but that's an assumption of, yeah, exactly, random mating and all of that. And this gives me this, these payoff entries, which you would then write down in the standard replicator dynamics, right? But the idea is then this is just a payoff, 2-player payoff, 2-player, 2-strategy game. Why did we go through this whole shenanigans of having a 4? I mean, you could have written just this down, but then the intuition behind where this comes from would have been a bit lost. Please, you have a question? I agree. I totally agree. I mean, why reinvent the wheel, right? I mean, so exactly. No, that's a great question. I will try to answer a bit right now, and more on that tomorrow. If I don't, please hold me up for it. Like, okay. So but I do want to talk exactly this. I mean, what's the, like, why? If we can do these things, and basically this is the same thing if you look at the 1970s book for Crow and Kimura, where they write down the selection equation of population genetics, and if this is what the selection equation basically looks like, if it's already there, why do we go through this whole game theory process, right? We don't want to force it in there for any useless reason. The thing is, what new insights does it bring us? And a question actually I think that you had asked was, how do we use it then? And just to quickly illustrate how you can actually use it, I want to talk about this Medea dynamics in the last 5 minutes now. And have you heard of Medea kind of dynamics before? Have you heard of Medea before? I mean, yeah, okay. Well, the story goes because, like, I mean, she was in love with Jason, and then Jason and the Argonauts, and then Jason kind of said, like, okay, I don't want to be with you anymore. And she got angry, and then she killed a few people, but on top of that, she also killed her kids because she wanted to deny Jason to have the pleasure of having kids. So that's the story that she gets rid of, murders her own children. Well, actually, you do see this in this kind of dynamics when you think of selfish genetic elements. And the question for that is like, okay, there are some kind of genetic elements in which can actually promote their own frequencies in the next generation at the cost of the wild types. So they actually kill some of the offspring which are possible so that their own frequencies increase in the population. This is a technique which has been classically found. These are the natural gene drive systems which have been leveraged to actually construct synthetic gene drive systems as well. And the idea over here is like, okay, you have two alleles, plus plus, which is the wild type, and M is the Medea. So the offsprings with plus plus and plus M, or plus M and plus M, so these are the heterozygote matings, or a heterozygote mating with a homozygote, right? Half the times, the fitness of the plus plus offspring will be 1 minus T. So if 1 is the fitness, which you would have got in a Hardy-Weinberg kind of situation, it is reduced by a certain amount because the mother is a heterozygote. It's a very specific case, right? So just to illustrate that a bit better, this is what the mating matrix looks like. So you have males and females, but if the females are plus M, what they do is the Medea allele, it actually deposits a poison within the embryo, but within the zygote actually. But the zygote can be rescued if the other allele, other M allele, is being provided by the male in this case. So the other M allele can produce antitoxin, which can neutralize the toxin. But the thing is, the plus plus ones will all die because by definition they will not have the other M allele, but their mother had been a plus M. Is this thing clear? No, it's not. Okay, so the mother is a heterozygote, let's say plus M, right? So the plus M can interact with plus plus, plus M, or M, right? These could be the all possible other males in the population that this particular female could mate with. But the only time when there will be another M allele in the population will be here, other M allele which is being contributed to the offsprings besides this female will be over here and will be over here, right? But even within this, there will be some offspring which will be plus plus. Yeah, here everyone will be having a plus allele because of the males. Here, partly some of them will be having a plus. Here, no one, because everyone will have the other M allele. So that means there is some death which is going to be seen here because the plus plus over here, the offsprings, they will get the poison because their mother had an M, but they will not get the antidote because the father doesn't have an M. Or in this case, the father did not contribute the M allele, right? Is that okay? Now in this case, if we go through the same kind of analysis as of calculating the individual payoffs, what appears over here is this 1 minus T, 1 minus T. And if you simplify the payoffs again for the Medea allele and the plus allele is paying the cost, right? It is not being represented in the next generation as it would have been if there was no this toxin antitoxin business. So actually its fitness is getting reduced by a bit, right? And its fitness is getting reduced by some quantity. In principle, you could put these things into a two-player payoff matrix. The problem is your payoff entry would be frequency dependent itself, right? Because there is an X that appears already in the payoff entry, which is something you don't want to have in a game theoretic sense because your payoffs seem to be independent. Right? So a natural way to actually keep this in would be to treat it as a four-player game and then just go through the same kind of analysis. What value this brings, I mean, okay, this makes it a much more amenable to where these things come from and how to include them over here. The point of looking at the equilibrium, point of looking at the, well, doing basically the full analysis of this thing is quite nice, actually, and it leads to some results which were new then in population genetics, which did not exist before. And I'll talk a bit about that tomorrow. Then. But I hope this part at least gives you a flavor of what you can do then with multiplayer games and where can you apply them. It has nothing to do with what active decision making would be, but you can see where the concepts behind it are being used. Right? Sorry. Exactly. That's where I'm coming to tomorrow morning, tomorrow when I start. That's exactly about the linearity. The issue is about linearity because anything that you take away from this is that multiplayer evolutionary games, they provide a natural means to actually include non-linearities. So because these things are non-linear with the Medea dynamics, the multiplayer games offer a very natural approach of including this non-linearity then. So, yeah. Depending on who the parents are, but of course, it would be a plus. If they are a plus plus, by definition, the if the mother contributes, yes. So that provides the poison actually. So you need the other M. Yeah. So the plus plus, this would be plus M and MM, right? So these offspring are fine, right? These offspring are kind of fine because these have the one from the mother. Sorry, this one has it from the father. This one has it from the mother. So this is fine. But the problem is the poison is also over here. But there is no M anymore. Right? So this whole set is poisoned. But as long as there is an M, then they survive. Yep. Okay, I can explain more again. Yeah, no worries. So we saw today like how do we actually move from using these generalized version of the replicator, because you can actually, these Fs are complicated. For multiplayer games, they look something like this, right? The average payoffs, they look like this. So if you can use that, how we can use it in population genetics. Tomorrow we'll see how we can actually use that for population dynamics or social evolution a little bit, and then extend it to theoretical ecology and socio-cultural dynamics in the last lecture. And to make it a bit more specific, this is what we did today. Yeah, tomorrow is going to be a bit more of the techniques which are being used for analysis within this. And the last one is on higher order interactions and collective beliefs.
Is there any biological example where you have more than two parents involved in birth of offspring? Then, I mean, this thing would naturally go.
There are, yeah. So it's interesting in rotifers, you do have that, you have a hierarchy of sexes. But the thing is, you always still have matings between two, but you could have influences which are exogenous to them. But there are multiple sexes. Yep. But since this is a school, I didn't want to leave you without homework. So I know you anyways hate me now for reiterating so many things. So I thought I can't lose more. So if this is the case, I would just give you this example and just try to deal with it. Like, this is the payoff matrix. Put the value of C equal to 1 and just look at it for different values of B, and we can talk about that tomorrow. Right? That's the story behind it if you want to motivate yourself. But yeah, that's all I had to say. So if there are any more questions or time, we can do something. But if not, which one? This one or the one before? The media dynamics. Okay, so that's. Well, we don't, right? Because you see the other x here. We see this other x being shown here. So actually, then this becomes x squared at some point. So that's where the nonlinearity kicks in. Well, male, female, and it has this certain structure, because earlier you could also say we did consider male, female. It's just that it didn't have any specific effect, right? So it's like, does it make a difference then, considering that? That's the question, rather. So, okay, so you're right. So male, female, and all of that, that's happening at the level of those diploids, right? Of those AA homozygotes, A small a heterozygotes, those ones. Those would be the individuals. But here we are not considering them as the players. The players are the alleles. Capital A and small a, those are our players. So this one is, sorry, M and plus. So in this case, those are our players. Yeah. Yeah. So this is not a payoff matrix. I should have made that clear. Right? This is not the payoff matrix. This is a very, you could write it down, you could fill it in, but then this gives you half the picture again still. Right? This gives you a picture when this thing is male, this thing is female. You need to write down the other picture when it is not the case. And you see how the dynamics looks like, add them up, and then you will finally get these values. Just like we went through the whole machinery before. Yeah. But once you do that, then you will see that because of such kind of interaction structure, because of these costs which you have to pay, because of the specific pairing in this case, this nonlinearity emerges then, once you simplify the average payoffs. Thank you. Thank you.